And so as we come to the end of Revelation, these closing two chapters, looking at chapter 21, it's very easy and tempting to suddenly forget all that's gone before and to focus solely upon this amazing vision that John now sees, this new creation, recreation. And yet if we do that, then we're in danger of missing something of the whole. For if, as we read this with the rest of the book in mind, so we see much more of the splendor of the vision, the contrast that John makes. But before we do that, it's helpful to notice the symbolic and not literal nature of the language. This is highly symbolic, as are many other passages in Revelation. And here, for example, we would ask the question, what were the walls made of? Were they made of jasper or were they made of gold? And we see that in verses 11 and 18. And then another thing we might ask is, did the angel measure the width of the wall, the thickness of the wall, or some other feature? We see that in verse 17. It's not clear. And so we can't sort of recreate in a literal sense this vision that John sees, the symbolism involved. And we also see how this chapter has influenced our own understanding, and still does today, of heaven. We still today talk about the pearly gates and the angel who will let us in. But as we come to look at the chapter through the lens of the whole of Revelation, we start to see a number of things. We start to see how the brightness of this new Jerusalem contrasts with the darkness of Babylon. We see here how the sea, symbolic of chaos and disorder, is removed. So we have this sense of true peace now being present, and how this peace, the presence of the Prince of Peace from Isaiah, contrasts then with the previous visions of suffering and chaos. We see too how every aspect of this city fulfills promises from previous visions. God is now present, the Lamb is its light, the limitless size of this city, its strength, that idea of the thickness of the walls, if that's what the angel measured, its inhabitants, and so on. And they all start to draw from the rest of Revelation, and we see fulfillment in this final chapter, in this chapter and in the next. And we also see how there's a contrast between all that happened in Genesis at the very beginning of the Bible, the order of creation, humanity falling out of relationship with the Creator. We start to see how all of this is now reversed, and we've talked about that in discussions before. Why was Genesis the last book of the Bible? And in some ways we see it sort of brings to completion all that happened in Genesis. And so in Genesis we see heaven and earth created. Here we see a new heaven and a new earth. We see recreation. In Genesis we see the elements like the sun, the night, the sea created. And here in Revelation we see there's no more need of them. In Genesis we see the curse upon humanity is announced. Here it's removed. In Genesis, death enters into creation. Here there's no more death. And we go on, and we see how all those things that were introduced in Genesis through Adam and Eve's disobedience, all those things are now done away with as man returns to his rightful place in relationship with the Creator. And we see this new creation is a full and a complete restoration. We also see echoes from the Old Testament, Isaiah 55, that invitation to drink from the water of life at no cost. We see that echoed here. We see too the coming of this new recreation, fulfilling the Old Testament expectation again from Isaiah, that God will deliver his people not just from sin and oppression, but that sin and oppression themselves are removed. The old order of things will pass away. But we also see how it draws upon some of the language that's flowed through the book, particularly to the 7 churches. In verse 7 of chapter 21, we hear again those words, "He who overcomes will inherit all this." And we see how not only will all around be new, but we see how we too will be new. We see how the rhythm of the Sabbath will no longer be required. The gates of the city will never be shut. We see how there'll be no longer that need to rest on the Sabbath, to reflect upon our sort of fallen state, to ask for forgiveness. For through resurrection into eternal life, we too will be recreated, will be made new, will be made or changed, that we might become what God originally intended us to be. And we'll see how that then flows on into the closing chapter, chapter 20, this sort of idea of the river of life, that constant renewal of all things, God's sustaining of all things. So I'll stop there. That's just an overview of the chapter. It's quite a long chapter, but I'm sure in